Hey guys, it's Mr. Irving again. Today we're going to finish up our joint chapter on the progressives. Those chapters 28 and 29. When we last left off, we were talking about President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, only the second Democrat since 1861. We left off talking about him being kind of hard to get along with, very religious, only left off talking about Wilson and his triple wall of privilege, talking about the banks, the tariffs, and the trusts. We're going to hit all three of those today. But first, let's jump into the tariffs. All right, first up is we have the tariffs. As you remember, Republicans at this time period, or beginning of the 20th century, they like a strong protective tariff. They want a high tariff because that protects American businesses. Wilson, being a Democrat, is opposed to the tariff. So he's going to introduce the Underwood Tariff of 1913. Now, this is not named for Frank Underwood, for any of you House of Cards fans, but instead Alabama Representative Oscar Underwood, that good-looking gentleman in the slide. Now, this tariff sometimes is called the Revenue Act of 1913, so your textbook might call it that. Don't be thrown off. This is going to do a couple things. First thing is going to put a big reduction on importation fees. It's going to drop the general tariff in the United States. So it was at about 40% in 1912. It's going to drop down to 25% as your general right off the bat tariff. Now, some people, this is going to cause them to absolutely freak out, but Wilson's going to stand on it, and he's going to sign this go into law. So all the lobbyists lose it, and Wilson's going to hold on. So tariffs are reduced. So the Democrats get something they want right away. But the Underwood tariff's going to do another thing that's very important, arguably more important, and that's going to bring back a progressive income tax. This is going to be granted to them in the authority of the 16th Amendment, which is also passed in 1913, a little bit before. But this is going to bring back the income tax. We haven't had it, if you remember, really since the Civil War back in the 1860s. Now it's back. And it's going to start very high. If you made if you made $3,000 a year back then in 1913, that means you pay 1% to the federal government. So 1% of your income from $3,000 a year will go to the government. Now, in today's money, what are we talking about? 3,000 in 1913 equals roughly 65,000 today. So only the very wealthy have to only pay a very small percentage of their income to the federal government. I would love to pay just 1% today to the government. That would be awesome, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But on the flip side, our whole society doesn't fall into chaos. So that's nice. So we have that going for us. So, Underwood tariff, two big things. It reduces the general tariff and brings back the income tax. And by 1917, the income tax is becoming hugely important because income brought into the government from the income tax is outstripping, meaning it's bringing in more money than our other tariffs and our other taxes. And it's really only kept going since then. The income tax by now is by far the biggest way the U.S. government makes its money, is from taxing the citizens. Back in the day, it used to be tariffs not on income. Now, income tariffs is by far the way to go. So let's keep going. That's the first part of the triple wall of privilege, which was the tariff. Next up, let's talk about how Wilson battles the bankers. Now, the banking system, at this point, when Wilson won in 1912, comes into office in 1913, the banking system is out of whack. It's basically just too old to deal with these new economic expansions that have happened since the Industrial Revolution. So the banking system has been outgrown by this new economic expansion. The currency is inelastic. The national reserves are based in New York and a couple of other a couple other large cities, but it's very difficult to access an emergency. So for the banks, Wilson is going to go to bat and come up with a Federal Reserve Act. Now, the Federal Reserve Act is only important because it creates the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is the most important piece of economic legislation passed between the Civil War and the New Deal. It is hugely responsible or important, the Federal Reserve. Very big deal. What do? Well, basically, they're going to have a nationwide network of 12 regional banks. You can see the map on the slide. And each of these districts, in these 12 regional districts, has a centralized bank. And that bank has the ability to issue paper money if it needs to. If there's some kind of emergency, we need more money to be printed right away. It can help regulate the economic impact and the economic decisions made by the government. And the Federal Reserve is going to be hugely important because they're going to guide the economy through World War I, which we're going to get into soon, and into the modern economy. Without the Federal Reserve, we would not, as a country, have developed nearly as quickly as we did, as our economy would have been stuck and would have been kind of stagnant. So the Federal Reserve is hugely, hugely important. Now, if you're confused about the Fed and how does it work, what does it do, I put a couple handy videos up on Haiku. So please watch those if you are confused on how the Fed works. But in general, big government body looks after the economy, guides us through trouble. Okay. Next up, we've covered two walls of the triple wall of privilege. So let's hit up the trusts. Now, what Wilson wanted to do for the trusts was he's going to come up with a Federal Trade Commission. If you remember, Wilson, he's different than Roosevelt and Taft in that he doesn't want the government to constantly intrude on business. However, he is very quick to go after business that could be cheating the consumers. He thinks that those things are completely out of line, and he'll go after them. He's going to create the Federal Trade Commission in 1914. This is going to be basically a commission of appointees that will seek out any kind of industry engaged in interstate commerce, think the big stuff like meat packaging, railroads, oil, and they are going to try to crush monopoly. They're going to try to seek out unlawful competition, if there's any false advertising, if there's any mislabeling of products, if there's any bribery, they're going to go after all of that. So they're going to try to crack down on big companies, but only the big companies that are operating in multiple states. Because if it's not in multiple states, the federal government can't touch them. It can only be the local government. And then he's also going to create the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914. This one, also a really big deal. This is going to make the list of unfair business practices even longer. So things that businesses can't do without the government intervening is going to increase. Also, it's going to give some benefits to labor. So if you were a bunch of workers working in a giant factory of some kind, you can now strike legally. The Clayton Antitrust Act legalized strikes and also peaceful picketing. So this is going to give you some strength as the labor against management, against the owners. So the federal government's still very much on your side, still very much a progressive president in that way. So this kind of sets up this Wilsonian contradiction. Because after the first 18 months that Wilson's in office, there's a ton of good stuff going for the progressives. I mean, the Federal Farm Loan Act of 1916 is going to make credit available to farmers at a very low rate of interest. So now it's easier for farmers who started the populist movement, kind of the forerunner to the progressives. They are getting what they want early on. Also for the farmers, he's going to pass the Warehouse Act of 1916. This lets farmers take out loans based on the credit of staple crops. So instead of saying, if I miss my payment, you can take my farm, now based on the credit of a big crop, corn, wheat, rice, whatever, they can be able to do that. This is another thing that's good for farmers. It makes it more flexible. He's also going to pass the Workers' Compensation Act in 1916. This gives assistance to federal employees during periods of disability. So let's say Mr. Irving worked for the federal government and not St. Andrews. So if my projector fell down from the ceiling and rendered me incapacitated, I could still be paid while I couldn't work. So that's a big deal. This is another law that helps workers that wasn't there beforehand. So very progressive law. Wilson's even going to go on to try to make even more progressive laws. He's going to push for a child labor law, but the Supreme Court is going to strike that down. Don't worry, we'll pass it later. That's why you're at school and not at work now. But he is going to be successful in signing into law the Adamson Act in 1916. This is going to establish an 8-hour workday for all employees on trains that participate in interstate commerce. And also you get extra pay if you work overtime, if you work over the allowed hours per week. And one more big moment for progressives is Louis Brandeis. In 1916, Wilson's going to nominate Mr. Brandeis for the Supreme Court. He's going to be the first Jew to ever be called onto the high bench. This is going to upset businesses and bigots, but is loved by the progressive base and makes Wilson even more popular with that segment of society. However, this is where the progressive contradiction comes into mind. We have all these great things happening for the kind of traditional progressive cause, but Wilson, as you know from before, very much is a racist guy. He's a product of his upbringing. He's a product of his time. It's not to make apologies for him, but he's actually going to slow the pace of integration at the federal level. While Roosevelt's going to take some big steps towards integration, Taft is going to kind of continue in that. Wilson is going to bring the federal government a step backwards in terms of integration. So while some people would say Wilson is this great progressive president, you can say that, but he very much is not progressive on the issue of race in the White House or race in the federal government. So let's move on from domestic policy. Let's jump over into foreign policy. Okay, big difference. A much bigger difference between Wilson and the two Republican presidents before him, Roosevelt and Taft, is going to be foreign policy. Wilson is very different than them in that he is not an imperialist. Both Roosevelt and Taft are imperialistic. Wilson, not so much. He is going to be very anti-big stick diplomacy, which was Roosevelt's, and dollar diplomacy, which was Taft's preferred diplomacy abroad. Wilson is going to pass the Jones Act in 1916 as soon as he can. This is going to grant the Philippines a huge gain in their territorial status and promises that they will get their independence as soon as a stable government could be established. So that, if you remember, that's pretty huge because the Philippines have been in a period of insurrection and some horrible wars against the United States since we took them from Spain after the Spanish-American War. Now, however, as good as it sounds that Wilson wants to give them territorial gain and independence as soon as we decide they have a stable government, we are not going to decide that the Philippines are a stable government until after World War II in 1946. That's when we finally decide the Philippines are capable of governing themselves. But at least the way it's written, it sounded like a good thing. He's also going to ease some tensions with Japan because California passed another law not allowing Japanese citizens to own land. He's going to kind of smooth those things out. So as Wilson is kind of taking steps towards easing the image of America abroad, which has been very imperialistic after the last two presidents, his hand is going to be forced, especially in Central and South America, but especially Central America. Haiti especially is going to be the first one that's going to test him. In 1915, Haiti is literally going to tear their president into pieces. There's going to be a big rebellion, and the president it's not going to work out very well for him. Now, when Mr. Irving was growing up, one of the girls in my class, their family owned a series of factories in Haiti. I don't know how many factories it was, but I imagine it's a lot. I just envisioned them owning a portion of the country of Haiti. But whenever she went down to visit their estate that they had down there, she had to have like 24-hour bodyguards with her all the time. And I thought as a child, that's so crazy. Why do you ever need bodyguards traveling around all the time? Well, the owners in Haiti are going to put some pretty severe working conditions on their workers. They're going to work long hours. They don't have the legal safeguards they have here in the US. Some of these progressive causes that labor gains, none of that's going to happen really in Haiti. So that's why they need bodyguards. They didn't want my classmate to end up like the former Haitian president in 1915 and be torn apart by workers. So, 1915, in Haiti, they tear their president up, launch a big rebellion. So what is Wilson going to do? Who owns the factories in Haiti in 1915? As you can imagine, it's us. So Wilson is going to send in the Marines to protect American lives, American property, make sure this rebellion doesn't get too far. However, we're not just going to leave once the rebellion kind of quiets down. We're going to stay in Haiti for the next 19 years before we leave. We're also going to send Marines into the Dominican Republic. They're going to stay there for the next 8 years. Also the Virgin Islands, if any of you have been, they sound lovely. I'd like to see them one day. We're going to buy those from Denmark in about 1917, if you ever wondered how we got those. So even though Wilson is trying to be anti-imperialistic, he's going to make some imperialistic sounding moves from 1915 through 1917, either by purchase or by force. Now let's move on to kind of the biggest foreign policy issue pre-World War I in Wilson's administration. That's going to be Mexico. So, long story, the Mexican Revolution. Mexico is basically in a state of complete revolution. I encourage all of you to learn more about the Mexican Revolution, because not knowing the basic facts about your neighbors is kind of absurd, but our test won't cover it. So, we're just going to break it down into the highlights. In the year 1910, a guy named Diaz is overthrown by Madero. 1913, the forces of General Victoriano Huerta are successful in overthrowing Madero, and this new guy, Huerta, is going to establish a dictatorship. Huerta, bad guy, rough guy. 1914, a guy named Carranza is going to overthrow Huerta. There's going to be a lot of overthrows, if you haven't picked up on that coming through. What does this all mean for the United States? Well, let's look. Overall, all these Mexican revolutions are going to accelerate the amount of Mexicans coming over to the United States from Mexico. Over 1 million Mexicans will come over the southern border of the U.S. between 1900 and 1930. That is a huge number. I mean, right now, the year 2015, the United States is freaking out because we've decided to accept 70,000 refugees from the Middle East. They are accepting way more than 70,000 per year back then. Overall, also, besides all the refugees coming in, the relationship between Mexico and the United States will sour very much in this period. And we'll talk about why in a second. Now, so the Mexican Revolution is going on just south of us. It's so close that some American citizens go out to watch, kind of images back when the Civil War first started, and Americans went out to go watch the first battle of Bull Run. As you remember, that didn't work out very well. This isn't going to work out very well either. Now, certain Americans push for us to intervene as quickly as we can, and some of those Americans are very powerful, William Randolph Hearst, who we've talked about before, we talked about yellow journalism, happens to own a ranch in Mexico bigger than Rhode Island. So he is very interested in not having Mexico fall into complete chaos, or having someone take over Mexico who says we're going to liquidate all the land owned by the rich and give it to the peasants. However, even though William Randolph Hearst and his paper and people like him are pushing America to try to intervene in the Mexican conflict, Woodrow Wilson does his best to not intervene. He's going to impose an arms embargo, meaning we won't trade with anyone, either the current side in Mexico, the current government, or the sides going up against them. When General Huerta was in the government, Wilson refused to recognize Huerta's government. He really doesn't like Huerta. No one really does if you study Mexican history. But eventually, he hates Huerta so much that Wilson will allow some weapons to be sold to Huerta's rivals, who were Carranza and Pancho Villa. So let's speed up to how this affects us. 1914, Wilson is going to send some troops to Tampico. Tampico is a coastal town there in Mexico. American troops are arrested in Tampico, kind of by accident. It's kind of a miscommunication issue. Now, the Mexicans are going to release these American troops as soon as they realize what's going on, and they're going to apologize. But Wilson is still upset about what has happened. At this point, remember, Huerta is in office in 1914. So Wilson is going to use this as an excuse to take out Huerta, or at least help his opponents even more. Wilson asked Congress for the authority to use force against Mexico, but even before Congress acts, Wilson's going to go ahead and order the army to use force against them. The Navy is going to seize Veracruz, another port town right there near Tampico. Now, he does this so weapons that are going to aid Huerta couldn't be unloaded, so we basically take over the port town, so any of the ships coming in from Europe can't be unloaded to help him. It's kind of a weird chess move way of supporting a different side. But any way you look at it, war is starting to look inevitable between the United States and the Huerta government. But right before things get out of control, Wilson is going to agree to let the ABC powers, creatively named because they stand for Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, mediate the conflict between the United States and Mexico. But before that goes on too long, Huerta will collapse. Not being able to get any weapons severely impacts your way to fight a revolution. So Carranza will become the new president in 1914. So now we're up to 1915. Wilson, he kind of supports Carranza, certainly more than he did Huerta. However, he doesn't like Carranza's partner in this revolution, which was Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa he sees as a bandit, and Villa then has started attacking Americans. He's attacked American soldiers, he's attacked American towns, he attacked a train at some point. So Wilson very much anti-Pancho Villa. Let's switch slides. Okay. So that brings us up to about 1916. Wilson at this point is going to send General John J. Pershing to get Pancho Villa. So we're going to take our army and invade Mexico. As you can imagine, Mexico is not going to like this very much. This is where a lot of that relationship going sour between the two countries is going to come from. So we're marching around Mexico, we're trying to find Pancho Villa, but General Pershing will be unsuccessful. We never find him, but war is starting to look more and more likely with Germany right now for events we're going to talk about in a minute. So eventually Wilson will call the army back home, they will leave Mexico, and General Pershing, as you can see in these cartoons, will just be frustrated going after Pancho, but he never catches him. What is the impact on immigration to the United States? Because that's a big thing that IB does care about for our purposes. So 1917, well, even before 1917, as just the Mexican revolutions are starting, there's a ton of immigrants that are going to be admitted to the United States from Mexico. So most of these are legal. We need the workers, we need the population. Come on in. So over 890,000 legal immigrants will flood into the U.S. but just between 1910 and 1920. So a huge amount of workers. A lot of those are going to take jobs on the railroads, but a lot of railroad construction still at this point. Now, unlike some of the caricatures or some of the images that are put forward in the news today about immigrants and all of them being poor and trying to escape because they have nothing, a lot of the immigrants that are coming over at this point, especially early on, like 1914, when a lot of the revolution is just starting, they are very wealthy. They want to leave because if the revolution is successful, they're going to lose everything. If Mr. Irving owned 30 houses and there's a revolution in Savannah and the guy fighting the revolution is saying, I want to make sure people can own no more than one house and we're going to give the rest of the houses to the poor. Well, Mr. Irving's going to want to leave before that guy wins the revolution. That's what a lot of these Mexican immigrants were in the position of. If you have things, if you own things, and a more socialistic candidate is about to win, you want to leave town before that can happen. And we've seen this not only with Mexico, but when Cuban revolutions are happening and other revolutions in Europe, a lot of the wealthy come to the United States to flee that. But we'll get into those later on. Let's jump into the Immigration Act of 1917, because that's an important one for us. Now, Immigration Act of 1917 is a reactionary act. There's hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants coming into the U.S., so some representatives in Congress start to freak out a little bit. So we're going to basically increase the number of people that are banned from entering the country. We're going to restrict some of that Mexican immigration. And this list is kind of gross on the reasons of things they keep out people for. So they're going to say if you are an idiot, if you are feeble-minded, if you are insane, if you're an alcoholic, if you are a beggar, if you are homosexual, if you are mentally or physically defective, if you're a polygamist, if you're an anarchist, basically anyone who's disabled can't come in anymore. So we're trying to find reasons to keep people out of the country instead of saying, hey, you're in bad shape, come on in, we'll take care of you. Also, it's going to ban all immigrants over the age of 16 who are illiterate. That's pretty controversial to start with. Illiterate in what language? It would be English. So if you can't speak English and you're over the age of 16, you're not allowed in the country. Now, that's even not the most controversial part of the law of 1917. The most controversial part of the Immigration Act of 1917 is going to ban basically any immigration from the Asian banned zone. Previously, we've banned basically all immigration from China. Now we're going to expand that zone to include much of Asia and the Pacific Islands. Basically, all of them are out. Now, attempts to do this before have been vetoed. We couldn't use literacy acts or ban all Asian immigrants because when Grover Cleveland was in office, he vetoed them. When Taft was in office, he vetoed them. Wilson also going to try to veto these, but it's going to be overridden by the Republican-dominated Congress, and they are going to pass these restrictions. So starting in 1917, if you can't pass a literacy test in English and you're over the age of 16, also if you can't pay a new tax, which is about $7, which is expensive in 1917 money, then you can't come in. So we're keeping out the poor, we're keeping out the disabled, we're trying to keep out all Asians and very much limit the amount of Mexican immigrants coming in. Now, so Mexico, there's a lot going on, but the biggest foreign policy story during Wilson's presidency is by far World War I. So let's jump in and talk about that. So World War I is going to break out in Europe in 1914, the summer of 1914, when a Serb patriot named Gavrilo Princip is going to kill the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Ferdinand. And that's going to happen in Sarajevo. Now, we're going to talk a lot about this in the future. Senior year, we're going to spend like a quarter on World War I and the causes of World War I in particular. So don't worry too much about this stuff now. But, so 1914, we have this assassination. Then there's going to be a crazy series of mobilizations. And all of a sudden, war is going to break out in Europe. There's going to be two main sides. The Central Powers, which are made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, eventually Turkey, Bulgaria, Italy, also mentioned as being a member of the Central Powers. They're also referred to as the Triple Alliance, which will be kind of confusing. Now there's also the side of the Allies, or the Triple Entente, because there's a French word, you know France is going to be in there. They're going to be France, Britain, and Russia. Eventually, Italy is going to switch sides. They'll be over there. Japan is also going to enter on the Allies. America will, way down the line. But these are our two sides. So we have this assassination and this greater Serbian Empire. It happened in the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, and today it would happen in Bosnia. So this small act that's going to happen there in the Balkans is going to bring all of Europe into a world war. It's going to be bigger than Europe, in fact. Now, the immediate cause of World War I is that assassination. However, there are some underlying causes to World War I that really is going to cause it. We're going to talk about all of them in depth next year, but it's good to know them now. The four underlying causes for World War I are going to be aggressive nationalism, the alliances, imperialism, and militarism. So we'll hit all four of those later on, but good to know in case there's a multiple choice question on your next quiz about them. Now, World War I breaks out. Woodrow Wilson very much wants to be neutral. The United States at this point is largely isolationist. They don't want to be involved with the European war. Also, Wilson's wife had just died before all this happens. He's not in the mood to go out and fight some big war over the Balkans in Eastern Europe. He could care less really what's going on. However, both sides, so we have the Allies and the Central Powers, or the Triple Entente and the Central Powers. Kind of codify them however you want to. It's just important you keep them separate. Both sides want the U.S. to help them, want the U.S. to enter the war on their half. And there's a ton of Americans who want the U.S. to go to war on their side. Think about it. The U.S. is a melting pot. We have tons of people from Germany, just like we have tons of people from France and Russia and Britain. So America is very much divided over who we have our allegiances to. Because even if you get outside that initial group, those two big alliances, we have tons of Irish. The Irish are certainly in no hurry to help the British. So the Irish want us to enter on the German side because they're fighting against the British. So things get very complex in terms of which side America would support. Now, the majority of Americans would actually probably favor us to enter on the German side. Germany is a huge feeder nation into the United States. We have tons of immigrants with German heritage. So it actually looks like more likely we'd enter on the German side. However, the king or the emperor of Germany at this time, this new united Germany, is a guy named Kaiser Wilhelm II. And a lot of Americans don't like what he's going to do with Belgium when he invades neutral Belgium to get to France. So you can go either way on who the U.S. is going to support more. But if you go based on the census, there's more Americans who would have supported Germany than would have supported the Triple Entente in World War I. So the U.S. decides to try to stay neutral. Wilson wants to stay out. Most Americans want to stay out, so let's stay out. Also, at the time when the war breaks out, America is actually in a period of recession. Our economy is not doing great. And all of a sudden, filling out these war orders for France and Britain is pulling us out of our recession and into prosperity. Now, all of a sudden, these factories get to make lots of stuff, and we sell that to Europe for them to use in the war. So American bankers are also giving huge loans out to European countries during the war to spend on American products. So American banks are making money, American companies are making money, everyone is happy. The people the most happy, as you can see on that graph, would be the Allies or the Triple Entente, because we are shipping more stuff to them. Now, technically, we are neutral. As you can see, in 1914, when the war breaks out, we are shipping goods to both sides, both the Allies and the Central Powers. But you can see the Allies are getting way more of our stuff. The reason being, Britain has the strongest navy in the world. They are going to control the Atlantic Ocean. So they have the means of picking up our stuff at our ports and taking it home, or basically giving secure passage to American ships to get to Europe and back. Germany, mainly going to have submarines in World War I. They don't have that ability. So we're going to ship more goods to the Allies or the Triple Entente than we are to the Central Powers. Now, the Central Powers are getting pretty upset about this, Germany especially, because it starts to look like we are favoring the Triple Entente instead of the Allies when we're supposed to be neutral. However, because we say that we can trade with either, we can claim we are still neutral towards both. So what is Germany going to do about this? Because as you can see, from 1914 through 1916, this kind of difference between how many goods we ship to the Triple Entente, your Britain and your France, versus how much we ship to Germany is going to only increase. By 1916, we have over $3 billion of goods going to the Triple Entente versus the Central Powers. So Germany is going to start to be a wee bit upset with us. So they're going to test American neutrality. February of 1915, Germany is going to announce the seas around England as being a war zone. They are a submarine war zone. Any boat inside there, they're going to sink. Doesn't matter if they're neutral, doesn't matter anything, because they are supporting the British. They could be moving goods to the British. Britain would then use those goods against Germany in a war. So it makes sense Germany would try to take steps to keep that from happening. So May 7th, 1915, the British liner Lusitania is sunk. Now, before this happened, Germany took out ads in American papers saying, don't travel on these transatlantic ships. We think they're unfair and our submarines will sink them. Travel at your own risk. President Wilson is saying, you are American, you are neutral, you are free to travel anywhere in the world you want to. This is going to come to a head eventually. So Lusitania, big British ship, is going to be sunk by German torpedoes out of a German submarine. Over 1,000 people will drown, so a lot of death. Out of those 1,000, about 128 of those passengers were American. The Germans claimed they sank this neutral passenger ship because it was carrying weapons that Britain could use in the war. Turns out that was true. There were a lot of small arms fire on the Lusitania that we pulled up from the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So Germany kind of has a justification after the fact. However, back at the time, Wilson is mad. The American people are mad. All of a sudden, it looks like Germany has killed a bunch of Americans without provocation. So Wilson, he wants to avoid war, but he doesn't want to look weak, so he publicly attacks Germany. He's going to say they were wrong, they shouldn't have done that. But he said there is such a thing as being too proud to fight. So Teddy Roosevelt at the time heard that quote and practically lost his mind because he wanted to fight desperately as soon as that Lusitania was sunk. Before the Lusitania was sunk, Teddy Roosevelt desperately wanted to go to war. Now, the Germans are going to continue with their actions. They're going to continue to sink ships, but they're going to apologize each time. They're even going to offer to pay indemnities each time. So Wilson's going to keep kind of saying, stop doing that, but not taking any action. Then in March of 1916, Germany is going to torpedo the French ship, the Sussex. Now at this point, this has gone on for a while, so Wilson demands they stop. If they don't stop, then America says they're going to be forced to intervene. Germany says it will stop, but only if Great Britain stops their blockade of Germany. Now, Wilson can't control Great Britain, but he says, sure, just stop sinking our ships. So Germany says, cool. Germany's going to issue the Sussex Pledge, saying they won't sink any more American ships. They're going to give warning. They're going to give them a chance to get out of there. All trouble, hopefully, avoided, as long as you weren't on any of the boats that have already been sunk. Here are some pictures of basically the no-go zone around the British Islands. Anywhere in those lined area, that means German U-boats will sink you if you come in there. So stay out of there if you want to live. Then we have some pictures of the Lusitania and the Sussex to the right. Almost done. Last slide. Let's jump in and talk about the election of 1916. So all this crazy World War I stuff is going on. Then we have an election coming up at the same time. Now the progressives are once again going to nominate Teddy Roosevelt as their nominee. However, unlike the election of 1912, Teddy Roosevelt is going to refuse to run. He hates Wilson so much, and he hates what's happening. He thinks Wilson is just sitting on his hands and not taking action, that he will do anything to defeat Wilson, so he's going to refuse to run, because he knows if he runs, it's going to split the Republican Party. So he's going to turn down the progressives, and the Progressive Party kind of disappears. It disappears into the ashtray of history. So it's just going to be Wilson up against a Republican candidate. The Republicans, Taft is now out. Wilson is too much, or not Wilson, excuse me, but Roosevelt, very much of a wild card. He's got a lot of baggage at this point, so he can't be it. They're going to turn to a guy named Justice Charles Evan Hughes. He was the Supreme Court justice at the time. He's going to leave the Supreme Court to run for president. If that was a good decision or not, we'll have to wait and see. He's going to run on a campaign that Wilson was basically wishy-washy foreign policy-wise. He wasn't strong in Mexico. He wasn't strong with what to do with Germany. So he's going to be your more, let's take action and be not imperialistic, but have more of a role in world affairs candidate. If you think America should act, you should vote for Justice Hughes. Wilson, on the other hand, is going to take the role of, I've kept us out of war. If you don't want to go to war in this European conflict, you should vote for me. For instance, send guns, not our sons. Let's just make money off this. Let's sell arms to Europe, but not directly get involved. So a big slogan would be, he kept us out of war. So Wilson is going to be your peace candidate. Hughes is going to be your war candidate. Hughes is going to do extremely well on the East Coast. On election day, Wilson actually goes to bed, and it looks like he's going to lose. Hughes has done extremely well on the East Coast, moving outwards towards the West. Wilson thinks all is lost, so it's all going to come down to California. And while Wilson and Hughes are probably both asleep, Wilson is going to win California narrowly. California is going to make the difference, and Wilson is going to win a squeaker and come out as the new, or not new, but continued to be the president for the next 4 years. So that's all we got for the progressive unit. So chapters 28 and 29. Be sure you study for our quiz. There's plenty of good review stuff up on Haiku if you were confused. And let me know if you have any questions. See y'all later.